When you talk about Larry Bird, you're talking about one of the fiercest competitors to ever set foot on a basketball court. He was a symbol of confidence and the ultimate winning mentality. But Bird's legacy wasn't just built on his incredible performances or clutch plays. It was forged in the heat of intense rivalries, many of which came against one of the toughest teams the NBA has ever seen, the bad boy Detroit Pistons. So, let's dive into the 6 most unforgettable tales from Larry Bird's battles with Detroit. The 1987 Game 5 steal, Isaiah Thomas. It was one of those moments that defines an era, the Boston Celtics versus the Detroit Pistons. The stakes couldn't have been higher. With the series tied 2-2, both teams knew the winner of this pivotal game would likely advance to the NBA Finals. Tensions were at an all-time high. The Celtics were led by Bird, gritty, unshakable, and willing to carry his team through anything, and the Pistons were under Thomas's command, an explosive playmaker whose leadership embodied Detroit's rough and tough bad boys identity. The stage was set for a clash that would not only deliver one of the most iconic moments in NBA history, but highlight the essence of two legends battling for supremacy. The game was everything you'd expect from a Celtics-Pistons playoff matchup: physical, intense, and riddled with drama. The Pistons were relentless, clawing for a win that would put them just one victory away from their first finals appearance in franchise history. They led by 1 point, 107-106, in the final moments of the game, and the Boston Garden crowd held its collective breath. With just 5 seconds left on the clock, the Pistons had possession of the ball on an inbounds play. It was their game to lose, or so everyone thought. And for Thomas, this was the dream scenario. Throughout his career, he had been the ultimate competitor, fast, fearless, and cold-blooded in the clutch. To him, this was just another opportunity to seal an incredible game and put the Pistons in control of the series. As the clock ticked down, he prepared to inbound the ball to his teammate, Bill, believing Boston was out of time to mount a response. But Bird had other plans. Poor Isaiah had no idea I was stalking that ball like a hawk, Bird joked years later. But there was no humor in the moment. His basketball IQ was unmatched, his ability to anticipate plays a thing of legend. As Thomas released the ball, he made his signature move, a perfectly timed lunge. In one swift motion, he snatched the ball, spun toward the baseline, and delivered a pinpoint pass to Dennis Johnson, who was already cutting toward the basket. Johnson laid it in with ease. In the blink of an eye, the Celtics had stolen the win, and the Boston Garden erupted into chaos. It still haunts me to this day, Thomas admitted in a later interview. I made a mistake, and Larry made us pay. That's what legendary players do. For Bird, it wasn't just another steal. It was a symbol of everything he stood for: patience, preparation, and an uncanny ability to rise when the stakes were highest. Bird didn't just take the ball, he took the game, the momentum, and, ultimately, the Pistons' hope of pulling off an upset. He finished the night with 36 points, 12 rebounds, and countless moments of brilliance. But it was that 5-second stretch that would immortalize him. Detroit was stunned. They had victory in their grasp, and in an instant, it was taken away. And for the Celtics, it wasn't just a win, it was an act of survival. The Pistons, with their bruising defense and relentless energy, had been one of the few teams capable of pushing Boston to its limit. That night, though, they couldn't overcome Bird's heroics. "You never count Larry out," said Celtics teammate Kevin McHale. "I've played with a lot of great players, but I've never seen anyone do the things Larry can do in the final moments of a game." The aftermath of Game 5 lingered long after the final whistle blew. For the Pistons, it was a heartbreaking loss, one that underscored how thin the margins could be between basketball immortality and bitter defeat. They would come back with a vengeance the following year, exacting revenge on Boston on their way to back-to-back championships, but that didn't erase the sting of what could have been. "That game was ours," Thomas would say. "It was right there in our hands, and Bird just snatched it away." For Larry Bird and the Celtics, Game 5 became yet another entry in the long list of moments that defined his greatness. But for all the accolades and praise, Bird was quick to downplay the drama in classic fashion. "I was just doing my job. If you're on the court, you've got to make plays," he said, shrugging off the spotlight. That humility only further cemented his reputation as one of the coldest, most unshakable legends to ever grace the game. It was this combination of skill, smarts, and a relentless will to win that made Bird a player who was as respected as he was feared. The Pistons would eventually establish themselves as the dominant force in the Eastern Conference, dethroning the Celtics a year later and winning back-to-back titles. Their intense rivalry with Boston was full of bad blood, bruises, and battles that pushed both teams to their limits. But no matter what triumphs Thomas and the Pistons experienced in later years, Game 5 of the 1987 Eastern Conference Finals remained a painful memory. It wasn't just the loss, it was the way they lost. Larry Bird had turned what seemed like a sure defeat into one of the most shocking comebacks in playoff history. And he had done it without trash talk or theatrics, just pure, calculated brilliance. And years after their playing days ended, Thomas was asked to reflect on his rivalry with Bird in that unforgettable game. Larry and I had our differences during our careers, but I'll say this. He's the smartest player I ever went up against. That play? That's Larry in a nutshell. He's always 3 steps ahead. Bill Laimbeer's hard foul, the enforcer. When you think about physical basketball in the 80s, Bill Laimbeer's name comes to mind quicker than just about anyone else. He wasn't just a big body in the paint. He was the enforcer, bred to bruise and bruise again. Laimbeer embraced being basketball's villain, a role he didn't just play but seemed to relish. For the Detroit Pistons, known as the Bad Boys, Bill was their emotional and physical anchor, a force that guaranteed the opposition would either fold or fight. And perhaps no one had to fight harder than Bird. For nearly a decade, Bird endured the relentless punishment Laimbeer and the Pistons dished out, their rivalry a bloody mark of pride in the annals of NBA history. While there were many moments that fueled their hatred, one incident during the 1985 playoffs cemented their feud as legendary. It was mid-May, Game 3 of the Eastern Conference semifinals in the legendary Boston Garden. The crowd was electric as the Celtics, led by Bird, were grinding their way through yet another brutal test against a physical Pistons team. Boston prided itself on its resilience, but Detroit had something different. They played basketball like it was a street fight. The series was tied 1-1, and tensions had already reached boiling point. Every possession felt like a war zone. But with Bird on the attack and the game in the balance, that tension exploded into something unforgettable. Driving into the lane with laser-like focus, Bird prepared to take an open layup. For a split second, it seemed like he had a clear path to the basket. Then, out of nowhere, Laimbeer came barreling in like a wrecking ball, meeting Bird midair with a thunderous foul that sent him crashing to the hardwood. Bird hit the ground hard, clutching at his elbow as the crowd held their breath. The sound of the impact echoed throughout the building, followed almost instantly by a roar of outrage. Bill didn't apologize. He didn't even flinch. He just stood there with his trademark smug grin, as if daring someone, anyone, to say he'd gone too far. I wasn't trying to hurt him, Laimbeer later claimed in a post-game interview, but I wasn't going to let him have an easy night either. Easy was never a word in Laimbeer's vocabulary. For him, basketball was about physical dominance and intimidation. No free layups, no crosses into the paint without a price. It was his calling card. Recalling the moment, Bird said years later, Laimbeer didn't just foul you, he made sure you felt it for days. The aftermath was immediate chaos. Both benches erupted. Celtics forward Kevin McHale charged toward Laimbeer to confront him, but cooler heads intervened before fists could fly. The Garden was filled with boos louder than a jet engine, the crowd voicing every ounce of their hatred for the Pistons' enforcer. But if Laimbeer was rattled, he didn't show it. He strutted back into position for the next possession like nothing had happened. That was the beauty, albeit infuriating beauty, of Bill Laimbeer. He lived for those moments when the crowd hated him most. He wasn't there to be liked. He was there to win by any means necessary. And Bird? Well, he wore fouls like that as a badge of honor. Where other players might have been intimidated or started second-guessing their plays, Bird thrived on the intensity. If anything, Bird said, those hits just made me want to beat them more. Bird wasn't just tough. He was unflappable, one of the few players who seemed to revel in the chaos. For every cheap shot Laimbeer delivered, Bird had an answer. And more often than not, it came at the expense of Detroit's defense. That game alone, Bird responded with 28 points, 10 rebounds, and 8 assists, leading Boston to a hard-fought victory. The Pistons' strategy was clear: make Bird feel every bucket he scored. But the harder they played, the better Bird performed. And what made this rivalry truly unforgettable was that neither side let up. For the Celtics, every game against the Pistons was an endurance test, mentally, physically, and emotionally. For Detroit, Bird wasn't just an opponent, he was the target, the guy they had to stop if they wanted to dethrone Boston in the East. And for Laimbeer, stopping Bird meant going beyond basketball. It meant turning every trip down the court into a battle for survival. But no matter how hard they hit, Bird's quiet confidence and killer instinct made the Pistons' efforts feel futile. Even today, when fans talk about the golden age of the NBA, the battles between Larry Bird and the bad boys Pistons are at the forefront of those conversations. And at the center of it all was Bird, standing up to physicality, taunts, and the very definition of intimidation. As far as Larry was concerned, players like Laimbeer weren't just obstacles, they were challenges. Challenges he relished, conquered, and turned into some of the most iconic moments in NBA history. Dennis Rodman's trash talk, the worm, takes aim. He was many things on the basketball court, an elite rebounder, a lockdown defender, and a true disruptor of opposing offenses. But perhaps his most potent weapon was something you wouldn't see on the stat sheet, his ability to get inside a player's head. The man nicknamed the Worm was a master of psychological warfare, and he rarely missed an opportunity to use trash talk as a tool to tilt the mental balance in his favor. However, when going toe-to-toe with Larry Bird, Rodman may have bitten off more than he could chew. In fact, one particular instance of trash talk didn't just backfire, it ignited Larry Bird's competitive fire in a way that still reverberates in NBA lore to this day. The buildup began during the late 1980s when the rivalry between the Detroit Pistons bad boys and the Boston Celtics was at its boiling point. By this time, Dennis had emerged as a key piece of Detroit's bruising defense, a player whose relentless energy and intensity defined the Pistons' gritty identity. Yet, it wasn't enough for Rodman to limit players physically. He wanted to dominate the game mentally as well. And so, in an effort to unsettle Larry Bird, the Celtics' quiet yet legendary trash-talking assassin, Rodman did what Rodman does best. He ran his mouth. In a post-game interview after a contentious matchup, Dennis called Bird overrated and dismissed him as a mere media creation. It was a bold statement, considering Bird had already solidified himself as one of the greatest players the league had ever seen. Bird had 3 NBA championships, a trio of MVP trophies, and a reputation as one of the most ruthless competitors basketball had ever known. Yet, Rodman's comments weren't entirely surprising. They were in line with the Pistons' ethos of rattling opponents at every opportunity. And what Dennis and perhaps others didn't anticipate, though, was just how much fuel this comment would add to Bird's fire. When the Pistons and Celtics faced off again, Bird crafted one of his most memorable performances, as if just to send a message. He torched Detroit with a masterclass in basketball, racking up 32 points, 10 rebounds, and 7 assists. Rodman's trademark defensive intensity seemed to falter under Bird's relentless attack. It wasn't just the numbers, it was the way Bird played, making Detroit's defense look helpless. Shot after shot, pass after pass, Bird completely controlled the game, showing not an ounce of mercy. Dennis was left scrambling on defense, a stark contrast to his usual dominance when defending marquee players. At one point, Bird reportedly locked eyes with Rodman after hitting a tough jumper and smirked, as if to remind him just how big of a mistake it had been to poke the bear. The Boston crowd, never one to shy away from the drama, roared with every basket, sensing the personal stakes Bird had in this game. By the final buzzer, the Celtics walked away victorious, and Bird walked away having said everything he needed to with his performance. Years later, he would revisit this infamous trash-talking moment, and his perspective had somewhat softened. "Look, it was never personal," Rodman explained. "I was just trying to get under his skin, mess with him a little. That's part of my game." But even as he downplayed the incident, Rodman couldn't deny the greatness he had seen that night. Larry, man, he's something else. You call him overrated, and he'll go out there and show you why you're wrong. For Bird, the affair was less about the words exchanged and more about the opportunity to compete on the highest level. Dennis was loud, but he was also really good, Bird recalled in an interview years later. You could talk trash with him, but you better bring your A game, because he wasn't going to back down. Praise from Bird was rare, but it reflected his respect for Dennis as both a player and an agitator. However, Bird also made it clear that trash talk, no matter how good or relentless, rarely worked on him. It only made me want to beat you more, Bird said with a smile. These clashes were part of what made basketball in the 80s so thrilling. The mix of pure skill, animosity, and drama that played out like theater on the court. Between Bird's icy resolve and Rodman's fiery antics, games between the Celtics and Pistons took on an intensity that bordered on Shakespearean. Looking back, it's hard not to admire how moments like these define the NBA of that era. Trash talk wasn't just about words, it was an art form, a mental chess match played alongside the game itself. And no one demonstrated that duality better than Bird and Dennis Rodman. For the Pistons agitator, it was about throwing opponents off their game. And for Bird, it was just another spark to fuel his fire. Rick Mahorn's shove, the brute strength. His hard-nosed approach to basketball made him the heart and soul of the Detroit Pistons bad boys. Known for his punishing physicality, Mahorn embraced the villainous persona that Detroit had cultivated in the 1980s. And there was no greater target for his brute strength than Bird. Boston's golden boy, with his immaculate jump shot, trash-talking edge, and MVP dominance, embodied everything Mahorn and the Pistons wanted to dismantle. The two clashed countless times, but one particular moment remains etched in the memory of anyone who watched basketball in that era, a moment that perfectly encapsulates the brutal nature of this rivalry. It was during the 1987 season, with Bird and the Celtics squaring off against Mahorn and the Pistons in yet another heated showdown. The Boston Garden was alive, filled with fans who had seen Bird come through time and time again. Midway through the game, with Boston fighting to maintain a slim lead, Bird drove hard to the hoop. What happened next was pure Detroit. Mahorn, positioned under the rim, saw his moment. As Bird launched himself for a rebound, Mahorn delivered a thunderous shove that sent Bird flying into the seats. The crowd gasped in disbelief. Bird hit the floor hard, sliding into the laps of stunned fans. Mahorn, meanwhile, stood tall, flashing a satisfied smirk as boos rained down from the stands. The shove was classic bad boys, a statement that no star, not even Larry Bird, would intimidate Detroit. Mahorn later defended himself with no apologies. "That's basketball," he said. "Larry's tough. He can take it." But I wasn't going to let him dominate us. But Mahorn's confidence didn't rattle Bird. In fact, it did the opposite. He was tough. I'll give him that, Bird said in his usual calm, matter-of-fact tone after the game. "But you can't intimidate me. Not in Boston." And Bird's response wasn't with words. It was with action. He torched the Pistons' defense, scoring 38 points, grabbing 10 rebounds, and dishing out 7 assists. He hit shots from everywhere, mid-range jumpers, three-pointers, and contested layups. For every shove or hard foul Detroit threw at him, Bird answered with a bucket. His actions sent a clear message. You can knock me down all you want, but I'll keep coming. And for Mahorn, it was all part of a larger strategy. He knew Detroit didn't have a player as skilled as Larry Bird, so they had to find other ways to level the playing field. "We played tough, physical basketball. That was our identity," Mahorn said years later. "We weren't trying to hurt anybody, but we weren't going to let anyone intimidate us either, least of all Bird." It's worth noting that Mahorn's tactics weren't just mindless aggression. His fouls were calculated, disruptive ploys designed to break Boston's rhythm. Sometimes they worked, but not against Bird. And what made Bird so unique was his ability to turn humiliation into motivation. He didn't get flustered or lose focus. Instead, every hard foul seemed to sharpen his sense of purpose. "I kind of liked when they came after me," Bird admitted in a rare, candid moment. "It let me know I was in their heads, and when I was in their heads, I knew we had the upper hand." Mahorn's shove may have hurt physically, but mentally, it only fueled Bird's fire. It was a psychological war, and Bird was among the most unshakable competitors the league had ever seen. And looking back, Mahorn speaks of those days with a mixture of pride and grudging respect. "Larry wasn't just a great player, he was one tough SOB," Mahorn said, recalling those titanic battles. "We didn't like each other much on the court, but you had to respect him. He just kept coming and coming." Bird, for his part, never dwelled on Mahorn's shove. "We were just playing basketball," Bird said years later. "Sure, they hit hard, but we hit back." And ultimately, his shove was more than just a moment in a heated rivalry. It was a reflection of the era itself. The 1980s were a time when basketball was a test of toughness, skill, and resolve. Mahorn's hit may have sent Bird flying, but but it also gave us one of the clearest examples of Larry Bird's unshakable mental fortitude. Joe Dumars's quiet trash talk, the silent assassin. Known for his stoic demeanor and unshakable focus, Dumars embodied the quiet assassin archetype, letting his lockdown defense do most of the talking. But don't let his reputation fool you. When it came to psychological warfare, Dumars had a wit sharp enough to pierce even the thickest of competitive hides. And while he wasn't one for trash-talking like his teammates Dennis Rodman or Rick Mahorn, Dumars had his moments of subtle brilliance, delivering comments so sly and understated they could make even Larry Bird crack a knowing smile. And in one particular post-game interview after a gritty battle with the Celtics, Dumars made a rare and cheeky observation. "I've seen Bird miss a shot before. Doesn't happen often, though." It was a simple statement, almost too playful to even qualify as trash talk, but it carried an undertone that encapsulated the Pistons' goal when facing Boston and its sharpshooting legend, to make Bird's job on the court as miserable as possible. His ability to rattle opponents without stepping out of character made him a unique thorn in Bird's side, and their matchups were chess games as much as they were battles of athletic skill. On paper, Dumars didn't carry the same menace as some of the other bad boys. His game was clean and cerebral, traits that often earned him respect even from those he guarded. But Dumars' defense was as suffocating as an invisible cage. He studied Bird's tendencies meticulously, staying glued to him on every possession, and forcing him into contested jumpers and uncomfortable looks. Their back and forth reached its crescendo in Game 7 of the 1987 Eastern Conference Finals. After 6 bruising games that had both the Celtics and Pistons trading blows, it came down to a decisive winner-take-all matchup. The Garden crowd was at peak frenzy, knowing their Celtics were one loss away from surrendering their East dominance to Detroit. Dumars, quiet as ever, approached this game with his usual calm intensity. His focus? Making sure Bird wouldn't be the difference maker that night, no matter what it took. And for most defenders, that might have seemed impossible. Guarding Larry Bird in a big game was like standing in front of an oncoming train and daring it to slow down. But Dumars wasn't most defenders. He mirrored his movements on the perimeter, sliding his feet and constantly keeping a hand in the Boston Star's face. Every jumper was contested, every drive funneled into help defense, exactly what the Pistons had practiced to perfection. Bird looked uncomfortable throughout much of the first half, missing jump shots he normally buried with ease. Dumars' efforts appeared to be working, and silently, he allowed himself to hope. But just when it seemed like his night might be neutralized, Bird legend reminded everyone why he was called a legend. Late in the second half, with the Celtics trailing and the Pistons' defense completely in sync, Bird found another gear, and no amount of smothering defense from Dumars could stop it. When Bird gets that look in his eye, Dumars later said, "You already know it's over. He sees something the rest of us can't." Bird erupted late in the game, drilling impossible three-pointers and dissecting Detroit's defense with pinpoint passes. By the time the final buzzer sounded, he had poured in 37 points, grabbed 10 rebounds, and dished out 5 assists, leading Boston to a 117-114 victory and securing their place in the NBA Finals. The Garden crowd roared its approval, celebrating yet another chapter in Bird's extraordinary career. Dumars, though, wasn't one for excuses. In the post-game interview, he gave Bird his due while maintaining the deadpan humor that made him so beloved among fans and peers. "Larry's Larry," he said with a shrug. "You do what you can, but sometimes he just decides you're not going to win. That's it." That night, there weren't any cheap fouls or scuffles, no war of words or trash-talking battles. Just 2 players at the height of their craft, giving everything they had. Over time, the mutual respect between these 2 competitors became evident, whereas Bird often criticized more antagonistic members of the Pistons, he rarely had a bad word to say about Dumars. He wasn't there to play games, Bird said. He was there to win, but he did it the right way. You had to work for everything against Joe. Dumars, meanwhile, respected Bird not just for his talent, but for his unflappable confidence. You had to punch first, second, and third just to get him to blink, Dumars once said, laughing. And even then, sometimes he didn't blink. And though their styles couldn't have been more different, Bird the brash, outspoken gunslinger, Dumars, the quiet, calculating assassin, They shared an unspoken appreciation for each other's games. In a rivalry marked by animosity, theirs was a bond of mutual admiration, one that elevated their battles into something timeless. Even now, decades later, the memories of those Boston-Detroit wars and of Larry Bird and Joe Dumars trading their blows on the court shine just as brightly as ever. John Sally's flagrant foul, crossing the line. Sally was someone who could be both charismatic off the court and absolutely ruthless on it. He relished his role as the Pistons' agitator, the player who could frustrate you with his defense, distract you with his words, and, when necessary, deliver a hard foul that left you questioning whether basketball had crossed over into boxing. But of all the moments that defined Sally as a member of the Bad Boys, one flagrant foul against Bird during the 1988 season stands out as perhaps the most controversial and revealing. The game itself was already on edge before the infamous incident occurred. Any matchup between the Celtics and Pistons was expected to be a war on the court, and this night lived up to the billing. Bird, ever the competitor, was having a great game, using his signature scoring ability, court vision, and grit to keep the Celtics afloat against a determined Pistons squad. Sally, as usual, was tasked with being one of Detroit's defensive disruptors, a role he took immense pride in. It didn't matter who his opponent was, an NBA legend or a rookie. It was all about finding a way to rattle them, and rattling Bird was no small task. The moment that would later dominate post-game discussions came during the third quarter. Bird made one of his signature moves, cutting to the basket with precision as a teammate lobbed a perfect pass. Sally, lurking nearby, saw the play developing and decided this wasn't going to be an ordinary layup. As Bird rose to finish the play, Sally closed in and delivered a hard, unnecessary hit that sent Bird sprawling to the hardwood. The crowd gasped. The referees immediately whistled for a flagrant foul, and the Celtics bench erupted in anger, charging onto the court to back up their star player. Bird, known for his toughness, slowly rose to his feet, shaking off the sting of the hit as he exchanged cold glances with Sally. From the stands to the broadcaster's booth, everyone could feel the tension. Sally, however, seemed unfazed. In what would become one of his most infamous quotes, he brushed off the controversy with a smirk and said, "It's part of the game." To Detroit's notorious bad boys, it was part of their strategy to wear down opponents, not just physically, but mentally. They wanted their rivals to think twice before driving to the basket or attempting a daring play. Every hard foul, every shove, every wink and smirk was calculated to keep opponents off balance. But this time, the foul felt different. It wasn't just physical, it felt personal, crossing an invisible line that made even casual fans grimace. And Bird, of course, responded in the only way Bird could, with his performance. Despite the pain from Sally's foul, he played on. Later in the game, Bird's intensity reached new heights. Every pass became sharper, every shot more precise, and every defensive stop carried an extra edge. He didn't let his emotions become chaotic. He channeled them. He still managed to finish with a near-flawless performance, making plays that seemed almost superhuman given the circumstances. "You can't let them see they've rattled you," Bird explained in an interview after the game. "That's how you lose." But it wasn't just the stat sheet that told the tale of his response. What fans and analysts alike noticed was the way he played the Pistons afterward. Bird made it a point to glare at Sally after every big basket, as if to say, "You can hit me, but you can't stop me." The cold, focused demeanor from Bird became its own form of psychological warfare, proving to Sally and the rest of the Pistons that their tactics might hurt, but they'd never be enough to break him. But perhaps the most striking thing about the Sally Bird incident is how it reflects Bird's ability to outthink and outperform his opponents, no matter what obstacles they threw his way. You could try to slow him down, you could take your shots, but at the end of the day, Larry Legend would always rise above. For John Sally, that flagrant foul may have been a moment of chaos, but for Bird, it was another opportunity to remind the world why he was one of the greatest players basketball has ever known. He didn't just survive the bad boys' tactics, he thrived in the face of them. That's what legends do. The rivalry between Larry Bird and the bad boy Pistons wasn't just a clash of basketball teams. It was a collision of philosophies, personalities, and legacies. Every foul, steal, and trash-talking moment added to the narrative of one of the NBA's most storied rivalries. All right, that's all for today. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.